It all started when I was 22 years old, young, ambitious, and naive in all the ways that matter. I had just graduated from college with a degree in business administration, and I felt like I had the whole world laid out before me like a well-drawn blueprint. My diploma still smelled like fresh ink. I was walking around with that quiet, self-assured confidence that comes when you've never really been punched in the face by life. At the time, I thought I had everything figured out. I had landed a job offer from a small but promising tech startup in Seattle. Nothing flashy, but it had potential, stock options, and the kind of workplace where people wore sneakers and said things like, "Let's disrupt the industry." I was dating Rachel, the girl I'd been with since sophomore year. She was smart, kind, the type of person who remembered your mom's birthday and actually called her. We were planning to move in together. I had even started browsing furniture online, saving links to bookshelves and coffee tables like a grown-up. We were talking about dogs, marriage even. Everything seemed beautifully, effortlessly aligned. And then came the mistake. It didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It came quietly, casually, as most disasters do. I ran into Brian at a gas station of all places, one of those weird moments when the universe taps you on the shoulder. We'd gone to high school together. He was the type who always had some kind of hustle going, selling knockoff sneakers, pirated video games, fake IDs. Back then it was annoying, sometimes impressive, occasionally genius. But this time, he wasn't the goofy hustler I remembered. He pulled up in a shiny black Mercedes with tinted windows and a confidence that looked expensive. His clothes screamed designer, and his watch cost more than my student loan payments. We grabbed coffee that afternoon just to catch up. That's when he pitched me the idea. A business opportunity, he said with a grin like he'd already won. Importing electronics, smartphones, tablets, accessories for suppliers overseas, then flipping them online for a massive markup. According to him, it was simple, low investment, high reward, minimal risk. He had charts, spreadsheets, supplier contacts, even photos of warehouses with stacks of seal boxes. He talked fast, the kind of fast that makes you feel like you're already late to the game. I asked questions, lots of them, but he had answers. Slick, confident, and always just vague enough to seem mysterious rather than suspicious. I should have known better. Somewhere deep inside, something tugged at me, a whisper that something wasn't right. But I ignored it. Why? Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to be the guy with a safe life and a boring job. Maybe I was just afraid to say no and miss out on something that sounded too good to pass up. So I said yes. I invested nearly all of my savings, over $20,000, into the venture. Every dollar I had scraped together from college jobs, birthday cards, and leftover scholarship money. I told myself it was a calculated risk, a smart move. But in reality, it was reckless. It was stupid. It was a 22-year-old's version of ambition gone sideways. For the first few weeks, things seemed promising. Brian kept sending me updates, tracking numbers, vendor confirmations, blurry photos of boxes that could have held anything. He even sent me a couple of $1,000s as a first return on investment. That shut up the little voice in my head for a while. I told Rachel about it. She wasn't thrilled, but she trusted me. I was convinced I was building something, that I was finally taking charge of my life, not just following the well-lit path. Then everything fell apart. It started with delays. The tracking numbers stopped working. The vendors stopped replying. Brian became harder to reach. His messages got shorter, then stopped altogether. One morning, I drove to the address he'd given me for his warehouse office. It was a fenced-off lot behind an abandoned strip mall. And then, just like that, he vanished. No goodbye, no explanation, no trace. Just gone. What followed was chaos. Angry emails from people I'd never heard of. Phone calls from unknown numbers. Legal letters. It turned out the entire operation was a shell. Phony accounts, fake invoices, doctored photos. I hadn't just lost my money. I'd been part of laundering it. Without realizing it, I had transferred thousands of dollars into offshore accounts linked to known scam rings. And worse, I'd signed documents I never really read, putting my name and identity on deals that screamed fraud. The FBI knocked on my door 2 weeks later. What followed was a blur. Interrogations, legal counsel, a surreal mix of confusion and panic. I kept saying I didn't know, I didn't understand, I was tricked. But the thing is, when your name's on everything, it doesn't matter how clueless you were. Intentions don't hold up well against paper trails. I was charged with wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The prosecutor painted me as a willing accomplice, a greedy young man who thought he was too clever to get caught. The trial was the worst part. It wasn't just the legal battle. It was the slow unraveling of everything I thought I had. My parents sat there in the courtroom, stunned and heartbroken. My friends, the few who showed up, barely looked at me. Rachel, she sat through the first 2 days, then stopped coming. I don't blame her. I saw the fear in her eyes, the disbelief. I wasn't the man she thought I was. Maybe I wasn't either. I kept trying to explain myself, that I was naive, not malicious, that I made a mistake, not a crime. But the jury didn't see a dumb kid try to start a life. They saw bank records, email chains, digital signatures. They saw guilt. I was sentenced to 10 years in prison. That was the moment everything changed. One decision, one stupid, impulsive, desperate decision. And just like that, the blueprint for my life caught fire. The first night in prison wasn't just the worst. It was a kind of awakening. A rude, raw, soul-crushing awakening. The cell was small, colder than I expected, and smelled of rust, mildew, and the quiet despair of too many men who'd passed through it before me. The mattress was barely more than a thin layer of foam over a metal slab, and the blanket felt like sandpaper. But I barely noticed. I lay there in the dim orange light of the hallway bulbs, staring at the stained ceiling, trying to make sense of how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. Just a few months earlier, I was a college graduate with dreams, a future, and people who believed in me. Now, I was inmate number 532109, just another number stitched into a pair of orange scrubs, stripped of my name, my freedom, and my identity. The fall had been so sudden and so complete that it left me hollow. That night, I didn't sleep. My thoughts spun in circles about Brian, the scam, the trial, Rachel, my parents, and this place where time stood still and silence had weight. At first, I was angry. No, that's too simple. I was consumed. With rage. At Brian, of course. At myself, mostly. For being blind. For being arrogant. For believing I was too smart to get played. That kind of anger doesn't burn. It simmers slow and deep, corroding everything from the inside out. I hated the justice system, too. I hated how easily the world seemed to turn its back on me. One mistake, and everyone I knew vanished like shadows in sunlight. For months, I barely spoke. I kept my eyes low, my voice low, and my guard high. I avoided contact with the guards and my fellow inmates. I moved through the prison like a ghost, hoping if I stayed invisible, I'd be left alone. But prison doesn't work like that. People notice silence. They notice weakness. And in a place built on dominance and survival, weakness invites attention, the kind you don't want. There were close calls, threats, fights, power games. People tested me, not always with fists, but with looks, words, pressure. I learned quickly that silence wasn't safety. It was just another kind of target. I had to adapt, and eventually I did. It took time, but I realized something that changed everything. I had a choice. Maybe not over where I was or what I'd lost, but over who I was going to be. I could either let this place define me, or I could define myself in spite of it. So I chose to fight, not with fists, but with focus. I threw myself into the only thing I could control, learning. I signed up for every class the prison offered. Anger management was first, ironically. Then came accounting, which was painfully ironic given my charges. But the real turning point was a creative writing course taught by an ex-professor who volunteered on weekends. His name was Mr. Alden, an old guy with a cane and a laugh that felt out of place in prison. He handed me a blank notebook and said, "Write like nobody will ever read it. That's when it's true." And I did. At night, after lockdown, I would scribble in that notebook for hours. Memories, reflections, fiction, whatever poured out. Writing became a mirror, one that didn't lie. It forced me to confront parts of myself I'd buried under pride and excuses. The boy who thought he had it all figured out. The man who'd been too afraid to ask questions. The inmate who didn't know who he was anymore. Then there was Hector, my cellmate. Hector was in his late 40s with silver streaks in his hair and eyes that had seen too much but somehow hadn't hardened. He had done 23 years when I met him, and it showed, not in bitterness, but in wisdom. He spoke slowly, always after thinking, and rarely raised his voice. I used to think wisdom came with education or success, but Hector taught me it came with time and pain. He never asked about my charges, never judged. Instead, he taught me how to survive with dignity, how to keep my head down when it mattered and stand up when it counted, how to breathe through anger, how to meditate with nothing but breath and memory. He taught me how to let go of what I couldn't control, even when that meant letting go of guilt, of shame, of the life I'd lost. Hector became more than a cellmate. He was a mentor, a mirror, and sometimes, though neither of us said it aloud, a kind of surrogate father. Through Hector, I learned that prison didn't have to be a grave. It could be a crucible. And slowly, painfully, I began to change. I read everything I could get my hands on. Philosophy, psychology, business textbooks, biographies of people who'd failed and come back stronger. I studied not because I had a plan, but because it gave me something to hold on to, something bigger than steel bars and concrete walls. Eventually, I began tutoring other inmates, guys who couldn't read or hadn't finished high school. At first, it was just a way to pass time. But then something strange happened. I started to care, really care. Watching someone solve a math problem for the first time, seeing the pride in a man who'd never written an essay, it lit something in me I hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Word got around. Soon, more inmates came to me for help. They started calling me professor, half as a joke, half out of respect. It stuck. For the first time since my arrest, I felt like I had an identity that wasn't tied to my crime. I wasn't just inmate number 532109 anymore. I was someone who could make a difference, even if it was just inside these walls. Prison didn't get easier. There were still fights, lockdowns, nights where I missed my family so much it hurt to breathe. But something had shifted. I had a rhythm now, a purpose. I was rebuilding piece by piece from the inside out. I no longer dreamed of escaping the prison. I dreamed of escaping the version of myself who had walked into it. About 4 years into my sentence, something shifted, something real, something permanent. Up until that point, I'd been surviving. I found my rhythm, kept my head down, taught a few guys math and grammar, and carved out a small space of meaning in a place designed to strip it away. But one day, everything changed with a simple, raw moment. It was Jamal, an inmate I'd been tutoring for months. He was in for armed robbery, tattoos up to his jaw, a chip on his shoulder the size of a mountain. When he first came to me, he could barely read. Said books made his head hurt. But we started slow, comic books, magazines, even kids' novels. One page at a time, one sentence at a time. Then one afternoon, Jamal walked into the tutoring room holding a folded piece of paper. I saw the stamp from the education office. He didn't say anything at first, just handed it to me. I unfolded it and saw the words, "Congratulations. You passed the GD." He just stood there, frozen. And then, this man who had once told me he didn't give a damn about school broke down in front of me, full on tears. He couldn't even speak. All he managed to say was, "No one ever believed in me before." I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, stunned. That moment hit me harder than any sentence, any court verdict, any lecture I'd ever heard. Because it was more than just a test result. It was someone rewriting the story of their life. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just surviving prison anymore. I was changing lives. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, not with guilt or regret for once, but with ideas. I thought about all the men I'd met who had never been given a chance. Not a real one. Guys who grew up in broken homes, went to failing schools, never had a mentor, a teacher, or even a moment of real encouragement. Guys who were smarter than they believed, who had potential buried under years of neglect and survival. I realized that what I had been doing informally, tutoring, mentoring, listening, could be something bigger. And so, Second Chance was born. It started as a simple idea, a peer-led education group where inmates could teach, learn, share experiences, and support one another. A place where your past didn't define your future. A place where questions weren't mocked and mistakes weren't fatal. At first, it was just me, Jamal, and two others, guys I'd tutored before. We met in the common area, at one of the chipped plastic tables, with worn books and dull pencils. No one paid much attention. A few laughed. Some called us teachers' pets, or worse. But I didn't care. We kept meeting. We kept showing up. Then something happened. Others started to come. Quietly at first, just to watch. Then to listen. Then to ask questions. The group grew, slowly, steadily. Word got around that this wasn't just about learning. It was about hope. A chance to be more than your worst mistake. Eventually, we had over 20 regulars. Then, 30. I wrote up a proposal to the prison education board, detailing what we were doing, the impact we were seeing. I expected silence. Instead, I got a meeting. To my surprise, the warden himself showed up. He listened, asked questions. I thought he'd shut it down, say it wasn't in the budget or it wasn't secure. But instead, he said, "Keep going. We'll find you a room." And they did. We were given access to an old and used classroom down one of the quieter wings of the prison. It had chipped paint, broken chairs, and dusty windows, but to us, it felt like a cathedral. The administration started supplying materials, used textbooks, notebooks, whiteboards. Some teachers from the outside even offered to help remotely through letters and study guides. Second Chance became more than a group. It became a community. We covered everything from basic literacy to U.S. history, creative writing, even public speaking. We held weekly discussions where guys could talk about fatherhood, grief, anger, dreams. I saw men who once threatened each other, now reading Shakespeare side by side. I saw laughter in a place where smiles were currency. I saw hope. And I changed, too. Running the program gave me something I'd never felt before. Not in college, not in my job, not even in my old relationship. Purpose. Real, soul-level purpose. I stopped thinking about how to shorten my sentence. I stopped obsessing over whether I'd ever clear my name. Those things faded into the background. What mattered now was what I could build, right here, in the place I once thought had broken me. I started writing again, this time not just in notebooks, but for real. I wrote articles for the prison newsletter, sharing stories from the program, reflections on the justice system, on education, on redemption. One of those articles caught the attention of a volunteer educator who submitted it, without telling me, to a criminal justice reform magazine. 3 months later, I got a letter. They had published my piece. When I read my own words in print, my name beneath them, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like recognition. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not as inmate number 532109, not as a cautionary tale or a lost cause, but as a human being with something to offer, with value. From that moment, something inside me solidified. Not pride, because prison teaches you to be cautious with that, but conviction. I had a path now. I didn't know exactly where it would lead, but I knew I would walk it, even if I never left those walls. When I was finally released, I was 32 years old. I stepped through the prison gates into a world I no longer recognized, carrying 2 cardboard boxes, a few books, some paperwork, and 10 years of invisible weight on my shoulders. It was early morning, gray skies, crisp air, and silence that somehow felt louder than the noise I'd left behind. The gate slammed shut behind me with a mechanical finality, and for the first time in a decade, I was free. But freedom, I quickly learned, wasn't as simple as walking through a door. The world had moved on without me. Technology had leapt forward like it was in a race I never got to run. People walked the streets with earbuds and digital wristbands, staring into phones I didn't know how to use. Cars could park themselves. Groceries could be ordered by voice. Even the crosswalk signs were different. I remember standing in a convenience store aisle, frozen in front of 50 brands of toothpaste. Whitening, enamel care, charcoal infused, organic, fluoride-free. I couldn't decide. I walked out without buying anything. That's what re-entry felt like at first, like being dropped into a movie halfway through, expected to play a role you never rehearsed. I had no job, no savings, no apartment. I stayed in a transitional housing program run by a nonprofit that supported formerly incarcerated people. It was clean but strict, Curfews, mandatory check-ins, shared rooms with men who were also trying to piece their lives back together. Every night, I lay in that twin bed staring at the ceiling, just like I had 10 years earlier, but this time with a different kind of uncertainty. But I hadn't spent those 10 years in vain. I had something rare, perspective, and I had a fire in me I didn't have before. Within a week, I started volunteering with the very nonprofit I was living in. I cleaned storage rooms, answered phones, helped new arrivals settle in. When staff found out about my work in prison, Second Chance, the tutoring, the articles, they asked if I'd be willing to speak at one of their youth outreach events. I said yes. Nervously. That talk changed everything. I told a room full of teenagers the truth. About arrogance, about blind ambition, about the consequences of one bad decision. But I also told them about transformation, about purpose, about turning a sentence into a second act. When I finished, there was silence. Then someone clapped. Then the rest followed. A kid came up to me afterward and said, "That sounded like me." After that, I started giving more talks, schools, juvenile centers, churches. I ran resume workshops, helped people fill out job applications, gave mock interviews. But outside of that, the world wasn't as welcoming. I was denied jobs without explanation. Employers would smile during interviews, if I even got that far, then ghost me the moment my record came up. One landlord told me bluntly, "We don't rent to people like you." The words stung more than I expected. People like me had become a new label I couldn't shake, even though I was no longer the man I once was. But I kept showing up. Every morning, I got dressed like it mattered. I volunteered. I networked. I listened. I stayed late. And slowly, something began to change. People started remembering my name, not for what I'd done, but for what I was doing. They started introducing me at events as an educator, a mentor, a voice for change. I wasn't trying to rewrite the past anymore. I was building something new, block by block, connection by connection. I began to rebuild relationships, too. My parents were hesitant at first. 10 years is a long time to hold grief and confusion. But when they saw I hadn't given up, hadn't become bitter or broken, they began to soften. My mom would call once a week just to check in. Then came the visits. Then the invitations. Sunday dinners started to become a ritual again. We'd sit around the table like we used to, but everything was different, more fragile, more grateful. My dad, who hadn't said much to me at all during my incarceration, eventually asked if I'd speak at his community center about reentry and reform. That was the first time I saw him proud again. Not in his words, but in his eyes. About a year after my release, the nonprofit offered me a permanent position, reentry program coordinator. It didn't pay much, but it meant everything. I was responsible for organizing workshops, creating mentorship programs, and advocating for policy changes. I started working with parole officers, lawyers, community leaders, people who were once part of the system that judged me. Now, they were partners. But the most meaningful part of it all was giving others a platform. That's why I started a podcast, Second Chance Stories. It was rough at first, a borrowed microphone, a tiny desk, interviews recorded in my bedroom or a borrowed office space. But it grew. We brought on guests who had survived addiction, homelessness, prison, abuse, and found their way back. Some were local legends. Others were unknown, ordinary people with extraordinary resilience. It wasn't polished. It wasn't flashy, but it was real, and it struck a chord. Soon, we had hundreds of listeners, then thousands. Community colleges played episodes for their criminal justice students. High schools invited us in for live panels. The podcast gave a voice to the voiceless. For many of my guests, it was the first time anyone had ever asked them, "What's your story?" That simple question became the heartbeat of my work. I wasn't trying to escape my past anymore. I was finally using it, not as a burden, but as a bridge, a way to connect, to lift, to challenge how people saw redemption, justice, and humanity. Every day, I still face reminders of who I used to be, reminders in background checks, in guarded conversations, in quiet judgments. But now I also face reminders of who I've become. In every letter from someone who heard the podcast and decided to change. In every handshake from someone I helped find a job. In every Sunday dinner where my mom saves me the last piece of pie like I never left. I'm not just rebuilding my life. I'm helping others build theirs. And that, I've learned, is what freedom really means. Now, several years after my release, my life is fuller than I ever imagined. I lead a nonprofit that helps hundreds of people every year. I speak at universities, consult with lawmakers, and serve on panels discussing prison reform. My story has been featured in magazines and documentaries. Sometimes I still wake up and can't believe how far I've come. So when people ask me if I regret what happened, I pause. I regret the mistake. I regret the pain I caused my family. I regret trusting blindly and not reading the fine print. But do I regret the journey? The transformation? The second chance I had to rebuild myself from scratch? Absolutely not. Prison taught me things no classroom ever could. Empathy, patience, humility, resilience. It taught me the power of second chances, not just giving them, but receiving them. It taught me that people are not the sum of their worst decisions. Most of all, it gave me purpose, a mission bigger than myself. If you're watching this and going through your own fall, your own 10 years, know this, it's not the end. Sometimes, the worst chapter of your life sets the stage for the best. And maybe, just maybe, that mistake was the beginning of everything.